The Crypt interviews in association with Mayo Leisure Point Castle Bar.
You're listening to The Crypt, the home of horror on Irish radio, and I'm delighted to welcome this week's special guest, John Borowski, to the show. John is an award-winning independent filmmaker and author with a large body of his work focusing on serial killers. So thanks so much for your time today, John.
Thanks for having me on. It's definitely a pleasure. I'm excited.
Well, John, you started out studying zoology and then you changed to film. Two very different subjects. So what made you make the choice to change direction?
Yeah, I'd always been interested in horror films, and when I was in high school, I had done makeup effects and masks, and, that was always my, interest and my hobby, kind of, but I never knew that, growing up in Chicago, I'd be able to make any, type of filmmaking a career choice, because I thought, well, okay, that's Hollywood. I grew up in Chicago, and that's, Hollywood, La La Land, and that's probably not possible. Just treat it as a hobby. So when I started going to college, I figured, well, I'll go into zoology because I love animals. I've always loved animals. I've always had animals in my household growing up, and, I thought it would be awesome if I could help them out, and be a part of that. But as I was going through my courses, I met some new friends, and they said, well, there's a college here in Chicago, Columbia College, that has a film program. And I didn't even know any colleges in Chicago had that. So I looked into it, and, that's when I, decided, okay, why not, go into filmmaking and because I could have always reviewed films because I had a massive, knowledge of, many films and genres, having watched so many growing up, thousands or tens of thousands, so many, whatever I could see. And, I thought, okay, why not go into filmmaking, and actually make films, I went in with the intention of narrative films, which is, I'm planning to do, hopefully within the next year or two, a narrative feature film or two. But I began by doing these documentaries on serial killers.
And isn't it amazing how you meet people in your life and it can just bring you on that path that you're meant to be on?
Yeah, and it was just one person, actually it was some other people that were artistic, that were going to this college at Columbia College. And I thought, wow, that's, it's just amazing. And it kind of, went from there. I initially, again, I went in for feature filmmaking, and, I didn't take directing classes because I think director's vision is unique to them, but I took every production class I could take, so I knew how to speak to everyone on the cast and crew. I even took acting and sound design and sound mixing and lighting and screenwriting. So, be a well-rounded producer, director.
Well, as I said in the introduction, a large body of your work focuses on serial killers. So what is it that fascinates you about them?
It's really their psychology. There is the horrific aspect because coming from a background of horror films, and, that's what I think I bring to the docudramas that I do. There's this kind of creepy, horrific aspect because I do reenactments. They're not just documentaries. They're not just talking heads and photographs, which I would consider boring. And, there's nothing wrong with those to get the, information across. But I like to bring a little bit something more because, like, when I was making my first film, which focused on H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer, the first edit I didn't really have reenactments. And I thought, well, if I'm watching this, I would kind of want to see what his basement dungeon may have looked like, or the maze-like rooms where he tortured people in. And I thought, okay, I think I have to up it to that next level to create more of an audience engagement piece rather than just a documentary, make them more like docudramas.
Exactly. Well, I have to say that's what I love about your documentaries is how you do that. It makes it even more interesting. Now, as you said there, your first documentary was H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. So he wouldn't be one now an awful lot of people might have heard of. So could you tell listeners a bit about him?
Yeah, H.H. Holmes was kind of like our version of Jack the Ripper, is what he became famous for at the time period. He came to Chicago. He graduated from University of Michigan Medical School, and he came to Chicago around the mid-1880s, the definitely Victorian era. Chicago was rebuilding itself after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and Holmes wound up scamming. His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett. Everything about him was basically a lie. He was a big-time scammer. He wound up scamming people out of, real estate. And he wound up designing and building this huge building in Chicago at 63rd and Wallace, which is now Englewood, but at the time it was the south suburb of Chicago. And, he designed the building himself. He was kind of like an evil genius. It was like the mind of Edgar Allan Poe. It looked, from the outside, it looked like the, reasonable building. The first floor had a pharmacy and a jewelry shop and some other shops. Second floor had some rooms, and the third floor was Holmes's office and some other rooms. But when you got to the inside of the building, it was like Holmes's duality himself. He had gas lines leading from his office to rooms where he would rent rooms during the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. So he had all these people visiting from all around the world, and he had gas lines leading to rooms which he could control from his office. He had a greased chute that ran from the third floor to the basement where he could dump bodies down. He had a huge walk-in vault in his office that he would asphyxiate secretaries and women in, and it was just, the basement was torture. It was basically just like a torture dungeon, a medieval torture dungeon. He had a crematorium that he said he used for glass bending. There were vats of acid. So what became apparent is he would kill receptionists or mistresses that he became involved with, and he would wind up selling some of their skeletons to medical schools in the area. And he had 3 wives at the same time. He was finally caught. He was his own attorney at his trial. Unbelievable what this man did in the 1890s, between 1880 to 1896 when he was executed.
Well, I tell you, he's definitely one of the most sick of all the serial killers I've read about. Because I actually hadn't heard of him. It was the guys at the Emerald Gore Horror Society had said to me to check out your documentary, Serial Killer Culture, which made me look into more of your work then. And I just could not believe it. And just to think that, like, the medical schools were buying these skeletons and that was someone's daughter. Do you know?
Yeah, and I really think, people ask, well, how did he do that? But again, you look at the time period, people could have just seen him as, it could have been a handshake. Here he owns this building, he says he's a doctor, he has a family, and it was about appearances, and who knows how he got away with it. But it was, he literally laid the groundwork for all the other serial killers to come, because not one other serial killer designed a building basically for the disposal of human remains, which is what it was.
A lot of these serial killers, they want to be remembered for their hideous crimes, and one in particular who craved recognition and fame for his murders was the BTK killer. Now, your documentary on Holmes led to you aiding the Wichita Police Department in their investigation.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I think it was a phone call at first that I received, or an email. It was from the Wichita Police Department. Now, the BTK had operated, I think it was basically kind of like late 70s, early 80s, and he killed basically an entire family, almost, other than 3 of the children, which weren't at home. He had killed many women, and he kept articles of theirs, mementos, driver's license, different things from the cases. And then in the early to mid-2000s, he resurfaced again. He started sending letters to the press and the authorities, and he even sent one of his previous victims' driver's licenses to the authorities. Again, he craved that attention. He had been out of the limelight. He's one of the very few serial killers that had done that, because not many could stay away or stop their serial killing for such a long time, but he did. And when he resurfaced, the authorities were trying to reach out and figure out any possible method to apprehend him. So they contacted me, because many times serial killers know of other serial killers or killers prior, to their becoming a serial killer, like their kind of serial killer history 101.
Yeah.
And that's what BTK did. He wrote the police initially. He talked about Jack the Ripper, and he mentioned H.H. Holmes in one of his writings to the police. So they thought, okay, here's a new film coming out on H.H. Holmes. It's on DVD. So what they did was they subpoenaed my records for everyone in Wichita, Kansas, who had purchased the DVD on H.H. Holmes, thinking, well, maybe, he was one of these people. Yeah. And then they were going to even have a screening in the hopes of kind of like luring him to come to the screening, because many times they'll go to a funeral of a victim of theirs, anything, they just want to enjoy that atmosphere. So luckily he was apprehended, before they had a screening, but, that I was a little bit a part of that, obviously not in his apprehension, but it was interesting that, that I was somewhat a part of it.
And, when you watch his court case, the way he describes the killings is like he's so proud of what he's done.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I had seen the photographs, the crime scene photographs, and the first family with the children. It was just awful what he did to them. He did hung up the little girl, and just awful. I mean, and that's the thing, I have to take a step back from these. That's why, another kind of reason why I focus on the pre-1940s serial killers, because it's kind of, like Holmes, it was a Victorian time period. It's so far away, we're removed from it. But it's still, it still does get to me. I focus on the horrific aspects, but in the end, when you look at my films, especially my third one on Carl Panzeram, the murders are a small part of it. I want to study their psychology, put them under a microscope to try and figure out how they became what they became.
That would be my thing when I'm reading about them. I'm very, very interested in the psychology, and some of them have had such horrific childhoods, the things they would have went through to start them on this journey.
Yeah, it could be abuse, or it could be, such as Jeffrey Dahmer, who had, killed and cannibalized and kept parts of his victims. His was more traumatic. Basically his entire family, mother, father, and brother, left him alone in a house at 18 years old to fend for himself. So he lost everyone he knew at 18. So then, psychologically, when you look forward and see that he's collecting body parts in his confession, he said he didn't want these men to leave him. It kind of makes sense in a way.
And he was one of the few that showed remorse for what he'd done.
Yeah, and you kind of feel sorry for him. He was lonely, but of course he did these awful acts, but he was straightforward. When he was apprehended, he told everything truthfully, every single thing he did.
Well, then, your second documentary was on Albert Fish, who was a serial killer and cannibal back in the 20s and 30s. Now, his murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd is just horrific beyond words. But to make it worse, he actually wrote a letter to her mother detailing what he'd done to the child. So could you tell listeners a little bit about that letter? Yeah,
that letter was awful. He's most well known for that, writing that letter. And in it, he basically describes, how he came to this family's house, and we're talking Depression era in New York City. People were poor, needed money. Initially, Albert Fish put an ad in a newspaper for, kind of like a young guy to help him around his farm, a strong young man. Well, he never even had a farm. It was all a ruse. But the first time he visited the family, he saw that the boy was kind of a large boy, and Albert Fish was like a little old man. Nobody would have ever thought he was doing what he was doing. He looked like a little frail grandfather. So, he collected his thoughts and he said, well, I'll come back again. And of course, he's flashing cash to this family. He came back again and, he saw their little daughter who looked kind of like a little boy. That was, his interests, young boys. He said he liked to torture them and hear their screams of pain and agony. And he would torture himself as well because he had a religious complex. And, he asked the family if he could take the little girl to a party, to a location that never even existed. He just made it up in his head. And this family let their daughter go with a stranger, and you ask why. I think it was, they really probably needed the money and saw that as a financial incentive. It's sad. But then, of course, he never came back. The daughter never came back. Not a word, nothing. And it was about 6 years later that Albert Fish wrote a letter to the mother describing, well, remember when I came to your house and here's what I did. And he took her way upstate New York. And when I made my film, I took that trip. And for me, in current times, it was about 2 hours. Imagine back then, you have to walk and take the subway and take the train and walk more. And this poor little girl didn't know where she was going. And he winds up taking her to this house, strangulating her, cutting her up, burying some pieces in an outhouse by this abandoned house, And then supposedly, how he described in the letter how he cooked her. He put her in a stew, and he put her in the oven with bacon on pieces of her flesh. And, to me, Albert Fish was, I think, the worst, because they had to create at that time for his court case, and that's how he was apprehended, because they traced the letterhead back to an envelope where he had stayed before. And, when he was finally caught, they had to create new perversions that weren't in existence at the time period. I mean, you name anything and everything, he did it. Drank blood, drank urine, ate feces, all these things. I mean, he was just depraved to the max.
God, and to think that poor mother, it must have been just horrific reading that letter. And you know what? Because, you say when you hear children going missing, parents saying, if I just knew what happened to them. But when you hear what that mother read in that letter, you say, no, you would be better off not knowing, because it was that bad.
Yeah, she would have been much better off. And, and about him too, once he was apprehended, he told the authorities that he would punish himself as penance for killing these children. Well, they didn't believe him. So they took him to have a x-ray of his abdomen, and there were 29 needles that he had stuck in his body that showed up on this x-ray. I mean, his story, again, is one of the most strangest and, depraved of all, I think, true crime history.
Oh, definitely. Then another documentary you made, which I've mentioned already, is Serial Killer Culture, where that was about people who collect murderabilia. So do you have any murderabilia yourself?
I do not. The only thing I have, and this is another interesting story, I was at an event about 4 years ago. It was called the Crime Scene. And when we all arrived to this event, there was a letter from Oregon State Penitentiary, addressed to the crime scene at the location where we had the event. So I said, well, let me film it. And the organizer of the event, he opened the envelope and he read it. Well, when he opened it up, it was from Keith Jesperson, who's currently in a prison in Oregon for killing 6 prostitutes. And he started reading a letter, and it said, I know of some who are there, but who I'm interested in is John Borowski, filmmaker, to make a film about my life. My heart literally stopped.
Oh, my God.
That this serial killer in prison would know about me and would want me to make a film on him. I mean, it was really frightening, Oh, and so I own that actual letter that he wrote, but that's the only thing. I'm not, like if you look on my shelves, it's like half of my bookshelves are film and the rest are like crime history and psychology. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm not really interested in the collecting aspect, although I made that documentary, Serial Killer Culture, to explore not only why murderabilia collectors are interested in these items, but why artists make songs on them, create paintings on them, write books on them.
And is that serial killer now who sent you the letter, is he in for life now?
Yes. I made sure to give him my post office box address, but yes, he is in for life. Yeah, and he's, I didn't write him for 4 years, but I started writing him recently because I thought, okay, I want to see what exactly what type of film. And I thought, well, maybe, there could be some sort of, maybe a reality show following me, doing my research, getting the letters from him, going to visit him, and, something like that, a little different. So we'll see where that goes. There were another strange story was somebody alerted me to a news clip that was about someone in, I think it was Massachusetts, and here in the U.S., that was arrested because he had cages in his basement and he wanted to kidnap and cannibalize children.
Oh my God. So
when I'm watching this news clip, it's showing the cages in the basement, and then they show a photograph of an investigator holding my Albert Fish DVD that this guy had in his collection. That was scary. And not saying that I, influenced
No, I know what you mean. Yeah.
To me, it was just, those were like the 2 weirdest, strangest things that have ever happened to me. But usually my job is going to historical archives, interviewing experts, historians, authors. So, and again, especially these cases from so long ago, I really don't have an interest in the murderabilia or visiting, serial killers contemporary.
But, it is very interesting when you watch these interviews with serial killers, like getting inside the mind of them. For example, the Iceman.
Yeah, his were chilling.
They are unbelievable, and it's just no remorse, no feeling. And the only time he shows any remorse is when he said he hurt his family, and that's all that bothered him. Of all the terrible things he done, that was the only thing that bothered him, was he hurt the people he loved.
Yeah, and it's kind of a twofold argument. Of course, there's for and against the death penalty, but when the FBI here began studying serial killers, they interviewed them. They interviewed John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, and they interviewed these serial killers in order to try and create these profiles, the profiling aspect of it. And I think, some things may be learned, but obviously if the serial killer is manipulative and lying, there's nothing you can probably gain from that other than knowing, okay, some of them are liars.
Like myself, you're a massive horror fan, and for over a century, people have loved to be terrified by this genre. But what makes horror even more terrifying is when it's not woven from fantasy, but the demons are in fact real. So we'll take a look at movies such as Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs. All of these were inspired by probably one of the most well-known serial killer, Ed Gein. So you have a book released on Ed.
Yes. Yeah, I just released a book. I came across actual files from the Wisconsin State Police Archives, and what they are, and what I do when I create my books, I don't really write them. I may write parts of them, but I like the reader to experience it as if they were reading it from the time period. So I have books on Fish and Holmes, and those are the same type of thing that I did with Gein, which is take these original documents and put them in the book. So you have psychiatric testimonies about the mind of Ed Gein. You have an autopsy report of the last victim that was found hanging in his barn like a trussed-up deer. And then the majority of the book is the actual interrogation with Ed Gein, where the interrogators, and it turns into his confession, but the interrogators are obviously, talking to him about what was found in his house. Now, I'm not sure if many people are familiar with the Ed Gein case, but what happened is he lived on this little farm in Wisconsin, here in the U.S., and he slowly went mad after his family died. He thought he would hear his mother's voice, so you could see a little of the influence for Psycho there. He loved his mother so much, and so he would go to graveyards and dig up bodies and keep body parts and prop them up and talk to them, again, maybe thinking they were his mother, pretending as if he was caring for his dead mother. So over time, he slowly went crazy, and he would make soup bowls. He would taxidermize their skin and make furniture. And when they went, and finally, there was one of the murders, they tracked down to Ed Gein's, place, his farm and his barn. And when they went in the barn, they found the victim hanging upside down, which he had decapitated her, took all her organs out. She literally looked like a deer that was trussed up, that somebody had just hunted down. And what he was most likely going to do was create a full body suit, because, his actions were a little feminine. So, it's still unsure. Did Ed want to become a woman? Did he want to become his mother? Who knows? Maybe both were possibilities. But he had all these women. When they went into his house, they had found a skull the top was cut off, and he said he made a soup bowl out of it, and there were chairs with, instead of woven seats, they were skin. There were skin on top of them. He had made drums out of coffee cans and stretched skin over the drums. There were, there was a belt made of female nipples. There was a whole box of, female body parts. He had some heads hanging on the wall. So, he was kind of like a ghoul. And at the time, they had only, could only say he had killed 2 women, which they found, obviously their body parts, the rest he had dug up from graves. So the FBI's first definition of a serial killer were 3 or more victims, but in 2005, they had changed that. So now it's 2 victims with the potential of killing more, and Ed Gein fits that. And he may have killed his brother, who died under mysterious circumstances. But he's very popular, and like you said, he was influenced for all these other films. Leatherface, because, he would wear the masks of his victims, and just, really... he lived on this, you could see him going crazy, because especially in the winters in Wisconsin, living on this little farm with no heat, no electricity, he basically closed off the entire house, just like Psycho, his mother's room was pristine. That's how the whole house was. Dean just lived in 2 or 3 rooms and lived just like a hermit kind of.
The common statement you always hear from people who knew these serial killers is that they were the nicest person. They were a well-known, well-respected member of the community, and they just can't believe that they had this dark side to them and they were doing these horrific things.
Well, and that was the same case with Ed Gein. People thought he was a little slow, but they didn't think, obviously they didn't think anything was really wrong because, they would let him babysit their kids sometimes. They thought, well, yeah, he's just the kind of the slow guy from the neighborhood. He never harmed the kids, never did anything to them. But, I think there was one incident where some of the kids would go home and say, hey, he had heads on the walls. And they thought, well, yeah, whatever. It's probably masks, And that's the case with many of these serial killers. Like, again, you look at H.H. Holmes, his duality. He had 3 wives. His last wife, who was a young woman he met here in Chicago who was at a department store. She had no clue. He was taking her around the country while he was planning to murder these 2 little kids who he had with him, on different trains and different places. He was a master manipulator, and no one would have known because, I think they enjoy that. It gets to a point where, okay, how far can they push it? And that's what happened with Holmes. And eventually they'll screw up. Or, it's a screw up such as a broken taillight on their car that they get pulled over for, or they just give up after a point. And, one of the, these serial killers just called the police and said, yeah, I've killed all these people. And they didn't believe him. And he had to call them back again.
God, when you think, though, back in those days, how many people would have got away with these murders because we hadn't the advancement in forensics that we have today to catch them.
Yeah, and that's why those early stories fascinate me, the lack of forensics, but also the tried and true detective work. Detective Guy, or when Holmes was caught, these children, 3 children he was traveling with, were nowhere to be found, and he kept lying to the authorities, and finally they said, okay, we're going to send a detective out. And when they sent this detective, he didn't have the internet, he didn't have computers in 1895. What did he do? He went state to state, door to door, based on the little girl that was traveling with Holmes, the locations on her letters, and he would knock on doors. Did you see this man with these children? Did you? And eventually he found them. And you would think it's pretty much an impossible task, to find these bodies of these kids.
Well, then, as well as your documentaries, you also make short films. Now, people can watch them on your YouTube channel. And I have to say, I really loved Mime Time. I thought the end was so funny. Really, really good.
Yeah, it's like, it turned out to be like kind of like a dark comedy, which I thought was interesting. You could create like a horrific dark comedy out of it, and it's streaming on Amazon Prime too, in the UK, and Amazon has opened their streaming to other territories. So now, my short films and my documentaries are on Amazon, US, UK, Japan, and Germany.
Excellent. And you also have another project coming up now that you're working on with Vincent Castiglia. So could you tell us a bit about that project and about Vincent himself?
Yeah, Vincent's amazing. We had been friends on Facebook for a while. We had been admirers of each other's work for a long time. When I first saw Vincent's work, I thought it was amazing. He does these human figures, but they're in states of kind of corrosion and degrading. Their face might be... you might see some of the flesh or bones underneath their face, or their limbs maybe turning into skeletal limbs, or their flesh maybe disintegrating. And, I thought they were beautiful images, artistically made. He's a surrealist artist. Mm-hmm. But then on top of it, you look at these images and they look just like they're sepia, but he paints them in his own blood. Yeah, it's just amazing when you see these works of art. No white paint, just pure blood. So he has to work with negative space as well, because there's no white, putting white out on top of it. And they're amazing. And now he's begun doing portraits in collector's blood. Like he did a portrait of Margaret Cho, the comedian, drew her blood. Usually it's anywhere between 13 to 15 vials of blood for a complete portrait, or more, depending on how large it is. And, he uses a phlebotomist or a nurse to draw blood, and so the gist of it was we were friends on Facebook, and he posted something saying, well, does anybody think I should do a reality show? And, of course, everyone was, yeah, that's cool. It's awesome. But, I told him, my response was, I said, that's kind of like a flash in the pan. And those shows are scripted. And you'd probably be manipulated into conflicts that you don't want to be in. And then, who's going to remember that in 100 years from now? You really need a documentary film that, highlights all your work in your life and your accomplishments. And that's when we decided to make the film. We agreed on it. And we did a Kickstarter, and, last year we were in production for an entire year. We filmed in New York and LA and Louisiana and Chicago, and we even flew to Switzerland and filmed at the H.R. Giger Museum in Switzerland. So, and now I'm editing the project. But when we started it, I asked Vincent, I said, okay, would you agree, to have me commission a portrait of myself that you could do, and he agreed. So, he's almost finished with that. So he drew 15 vials of my blood, and he's doing my, portrait of my blood, which is interesting. And it's just, and again, it's fascinating. And when you watch the film, you're going to learn why he's painting in blood. It's not just a gimmick. He didn't wake up one day and do it. He's had a very interesting and dark, background, and it's all going to be shown in the film.
Well, people should definitely look up his work, because it really is something else. Because I'd reading about him first, and you read he's painting in blood, and you're thinking, God, how would that look? And then you look at his work, and it's outstanding. It is unbelievable that that's blood they're painted out of.
Yeah, not many people, even you would never know that. You never would. 'Cause again, it turns into kind of like a sepia, but his depth and his knowledge of the human anatomy and, how beautiful the images look, he's been compared to great masters, because of, the way his images are created. They're beautiful. And the film's going to be called Bloodlines, The Art and Life of Vincent Castiglia. So I'm editing that now, and, hopefully it'll be out there, sometime later this year, early next year.
Excellent. I'm really, really looking forward to watching that. Well, then finally, before I let you go, John, where can people follow you on social media, website, etc.?
It's everywhere. I think if you type up serial killer documentary or filmmaker, my name will come up. I've got my site, which is just johnborowski.com. There are my films, they're on Amazon, they're streaming everywhere, they're on Hulu. So you can definitely find, the films and books out there, usually again on Amazon. The books and movies are all on Amazon, so you could stream them, download them, and they're out there. Excellent.
Well, John, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. I could talk to you all day. I'd definitely love to have you back on the show again another time. We could talk about some more serial killer cases.
Yeah, anytime. I'd love to. My schedule's open for you. I love the Crypt.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Rita. Take care.
The Crypt interviews in association with Mayo Leisure Point Castle Bar.